Nobody has ever managed to make Angelina Jolie flinch on live television. Joy Behar believed she'd finally found the question that would crack it. She waited until the segment had settled into something warm and easy. Angelina laughing, actually laughing, about a film that had cost her more than anyone in that studio understood. That's exactly when Joy leaned forward with a question she'd clearly built in advance, layered carefully enough that it almost sounded like concern. Angelina didn't answer right away. She simply looked at Joy for a long moment, the kind of look that made the entire studio go quiet without anyone telling them to. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, almost gentle, and that gentleness was exactly what made it devastating. By the time the segment ended, a woman who has spent 2 decades making guests uncomfortable on national television would find herself utterly speechless at her own table, while a 50-year-old Oscar winner stood walked off the set of The View with the unhurried dignity of someone who had already survived far worse rooms than this one. Subscribe right now, because you're about to watch exactly what happens when you try to turn a woman's deepest scars into a talk show moment, and she refuses to let you. The View studio had a charged, reverent energy that morning, the kind reserved for a guest whose presence alone changes the temperature of a room. Angelina Jolie, 50, arrived to promote Couture, her most personal film in over a decade, wearing a tailored charcoal blazer, her hair loose, her expression carrying that particular calm she'd perfected across 3 decades in front of cameras. "Angelina Jolie, everybody!" Whoopi announced, and the ovation was immediate, the audience rising before she'd even reached the chair. "Thank you for having me," Angelina said, settling in with quiet grace, her voice soft but carrying easily across the studio. The first several minutes moved with unexpected warmth. Couture, the story of a filmmaker who receives a breast cancer diagnosis mid-shoot in Paris, and how close the material had cut to her own life. She talked about working with director Alice Winocour, about the strange privilege of shooting inside Chanel's actual atelier, about finally feeling ready, after all these years, to be vulnerable on screen in a way she'd avoided since her preventive mastectomy over a decade earlier. "I didn't think I'd ever want to revisit any of it on camera," she said. But something about how Alice wrote it felt less like exposure and more like honesty. There's a difference. This wasn't a woman defined by illness. She was defined by how much she still wanted to live. She mentioned Sunny, too, the action film she'd just wrapped, laughing softly about how strange it felt returning to physical, high-intensity work after years away from it. "I forgot how much my body actually remembers," she said. "Muscle memory is a strange kind of comfort." Sarah asked about her recent trip to the Egypt-Gaza border, and Angelina's expression sharpened with quiet intensity. "I've spent 20 years doing that work because I believe in it, not because anyone's watching," she said. "Some of it gets photographed, most of it doesn't. That's never been the point." The audience applauded warmly. This was the Angelina Jolie the world had grown to respect. Joy hadn't said much yet. She sat with a small notepad, tapping her pen against it in a rhythm the other hosts had started to notice. It was Alyssa who opened the door, entirely without meaning to. "Angelina, Couture feels like your most personal role in years. What made you finally ready to tell a story this close to your own?" Angelina considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness. "I think you reach a point where hiding the scars takes more energy than showing them. I lost my mother, my grandmother, and aunt, all to this disease. Making this film felt like finally letting that grief have a place to live outside of me." That's when Joy leaned forward, her notepad now open in front of her. "Speaking of letting things have a place to live," she said, her tone shifting just enough that the temperature in the studio dropped several degrees. "I have to ask something a lot of people have wondered." The room went quiet, in that particular way rooms go quiet right before something breaks. Angelina's expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "Go ahead," she said evenly. "You've built an entire film around your mastectomy story, right around the same time your custody battle with Brad is still dragging through court. Right around the same time you're doing very photographed humanitarian trips, Joy said. Do you ever worry that all of it, the film, the trips, the timing, starts to look less like healing and more like a very well-managed campaign to control your public narrative during a messy divorce? A ripple moved through the audience. Whoopi's hand drifted toward her earpiece. That's a lot to unpack in one question, Angelina said, her voice calm but carrying new precision. Let's take it apart piece by piece, shall we? I welcome that, Joy said, sitting back with visible confidence. I've had the BRCA1 gene since before most people in this industry knew what that meant, Angelina began. I wrote about my mastectomy in the New York Times in 2013, over a decade before this film existed, when there was no divorce, no custody battle, nothing to distract from. I didn't create that story for a narrative. I lived it, publicly, when it actually cost me something to be that open. But the timing of the film specifically, Alice Winnicor wrote this role for me 2 years ago, before some of what you're describing was even public. Angelina cut in, her voice still even but firmer now. You're building a timeline that doesn't actually exist to make a point that was never true to begin with. There's also the ongoing legal battle over the winery, Joy pressed, glancing at her notepad. Brad's team has publicly requested access to your private communications about the sale of your stake. That's still active litigation. Doesn't continuing to promote deeply personal projects while that's unresolved feel like managing perception rather than just living your life? That litigation exists because I sold my share of a business I co-owned, which I had every legal right to do, Angelina said, her voice carrying new precision. The fact that it's contested doesn't mean I orchestrated a film 4 years earlier to manage its optics. You're connecting two things that share a timeline and nothing else, Joy. That's not journalism. That's just proximity dressed up as evidence. Joy tried a different angle. Fine, let's set the film aside. What about Gaza? Rafah? Very photographed. Very public appearances during a period when a lot of people would say your image could use some rehabilitation given the divorce headlines. The studio went dead silent. Even Sarah's hand froze over her notes. I've been a UN Goodwill Ambassador for over 20 years, Angelina said, and for the first time, something colder entered her voice. I was doing this work before Brad and I were ever married, and I'll be doing it long after every headline about our divorce is forgotten. You're suggesting I stood at a border crossing full of injured children and thought about my public image. I want you to sit with how that sounds out loud. I'm not saying the work isn't real, Joy said, though her confidence had visibly thinned. I'm asking about the optics. There's no version of optics that explains 2 decades of unpaid work in places most people won't even watch documentaries about, Angelina replied. You don't get photographed for optics in Rafah. You get photographed because journalists happen to be documenting a humanitarian crisis, and I happen to be there, the same as I've been in 40 other places nobody built a narrative around. 40 other places most viewers have never heard of because there wasn't a camera crew to capture them, Joy said. Doesn't that itself prove the point? That the trips people know about happen to line up with moments your image could use some rehabilitation? Or it proves that some border crossings have working press access and others don't, Angelina said, an edge of genuine frustration entering her voice for the first time. I've been turned away from more camps than I've ever been photographed inside of. You're building a pattern out of the exceptions and ignoring everything that doesn't fit your theory. The room had gone completely still. Even the camera operators seemed to lean in. I think it's fair to ask whether public figures use humanitarian work strategically, Joy pressed, attempting to regain footing. It's fair to ask that about people who started doing this work when cameras arrived and stopped the moment cameras left, Angelina said. That's never been me, and if you'd done even a little research instead of building a theory, you'd know that. I've been doing unphotographed work in refugee camps since 2001. Nobody built a headline out of most of it. That's rather the point of actually caring about something, Joy. You keep doing it when nobody's counting. What about your children then? Joy asked, shifting tactics. 6 kids who've grown up watching every part of this play out publicly. Do you ever worry that continuing to be this visible, this available for interviews about deeply personal subjects, adds to what they're already carrying? The room went very still at that. Even Whoopi's expression tightened. I think about that every single day, Angelina said, her voice dropping, losing none of its steadiness but gaining something rawer underneath it. It's the calculation I make before every interview, every film, every choice to speak publicly at all. But my children also watched their mother survive something that could have taken her the way it took their grandmother. I'd rather they see me choose honesty over hiding, even when it's hard, than grow up thinking silence is the only safe response to fear. That's not visibility for its own sake, Joy. That's the only kind of mothering I know how to do. Joy's composure cracked slightly. I didn't mean to suggest the work wasn't genuine. Yes, you did, Angelina said, quiet and precise. You suggested my mother's death, my own mastectomy, and children injured in an active war zone were all instruments in a public relations strategy. That's not a question, Joy. That's an accusation dressed up as curiosity, and I think you knew that when you wrote it down before I ever sat in this chair. The audience had gone utterly silent. Sarah had stopped pretending to look at her notes. I came here today to talk about a film that took me over a decade to feel ready to make, Angelina continued. A film about grief, about scars, about the specific kind of fear that comes from watching cancer take the women in your family one by one. My mother was 56. My grandmother went the same way. My aunt too. I made a choice a decade ago that meant I would never join them on that list, and I have never once regretted it, even on the hardest days. Instead, you spent this entire segment trying to turn that grief into evidence of something calculating. I understand it's personal, Joy started. You don't actually, Angelina said, not unkindly but with absolute clarity. If you understood how personal it was, you wouldn't have opened with a theory about timing. You'd have opened with a question about my mother. Nobody who actually understands grief leads with suspicion. I think it's a fair question for anyone in the public eye, Joy tried again. Then ask it fairly, Angelina said, cutting her off, her voice never rising but somehow filling the entire studio. Ask me directly if I've ever manufactured pain for sympathy. I'll answer you honestly. No. I have never once needed to manufacture anything. My mother is actually dead. My grandmother is actually dead. My children have actually watched their parents go through years of legal proceedings neither of us wanted for them. None of that was staged for content, Joy. All of it actually happened to real people, including 6 children who didn't ask to have their family's pain narrated by strangers on morning television. Whoopi tried to interject gently. I think what Joy is maybe trying to— I know exactly what she's trying to do, Angelina said, not unkindly but with absolute clarity. She's trying to find the version of me that cracks on camera, the one that gets defensive enough to make a clip. I understand the impulse. I've watched it happen to other guests on this very show. But I didn't survive the last decade of my life to perform outrage for good television now. Joy tried one more angle, her voice tightening with something closer to desperation now. You're also returning to action films after 5 years away. Sunny, this high-intensity comeback. Some industry observers have suggested that's a calculated pivot too, reclaiming a tougher, more powerful image right when the public narrative around you has leaned toward victim. Is that fair? The studio audience gasped audibly at the word victim. Even Sarah flinched visibly. Angelina was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had gone very still, carrying a different kind of intensity than before. I have never once called myself a victim, Joy. Not in a courtroom, not in an interview, not to my own children, she said. You just did that for me, on national television, apparently to make a point about a movie. I took Sunny because I missed feeling strong in my own body after years of feeling like I was constantly defending myself in rooms full of lawyers. That's not a narrative pivot. That's a woman remembering what her body is capable of after years of forgetting. She looked directly at Joy, her expression unreadable. You've spent this entire morning deciding what every choice I've made actually means, without once asking me what it actually felt like to make them. That's not journalism, Joy. That's narration. And I didn't come here to be narrated. She looked directly at Joy, her expression settling into something almost sad. You had an opportunity this morning to ask a woman about grief, about scars, about what it actually feels like to lose your mother young enough that you spend the rest of your life a little bit afraid of your own body. Instead, you decided suspicion was more interesting than truth. That says a great deal more about the question than it does about me. That's not fair to how I intended it, Joy started, her voice noticeably smaller now. Isn't it? Angelina tilted her head, studying her with quiet patience. I've done thousands of interviews in 30 years, Joy. I know precisely what it sounds like when someone's genuinely curious about my life, and I know precisely what it sounds like when someone's hunting for a headline dressed up as concern. This morning sounded exactly like the second one. She let the silence stretch a moment longer before continuing, her voice gaining a quiet, unshakable finality. I've been called difficult, calculating, cold, dramatic. Every version of a woman men in this industry never had to be called for making the exact same choices I made. I stopped needing your approval a long time ago, Joy. What I won't stop doing is correcting the record when someone tries to turn my life into a cautionary tale for the cameras. She reached for her purse, the movement unhurried, the studio falling into a silence that felt different from every silence before it. I'm not angry with you, she said quietly. I think you believe you're doing something important, but there's a version of accountability that actually helps people understand the world better, and there's a version that just turns real pain into a talking point. This morning was the second one, and I think everyone in this room just watched the difference in real time. Angelina, I think we're just having a candid conversation. Joy tried one last time, but Angelina was already standing. No, she said, calm and final. A candid conversation doesn't arrive with a theory already written before the guest sits down. I've survived enough of these to recognize an ambush wearing a soft voice. She looked around the studio, at the stunned audience, at Sarah's stricken expression, at Whoopi, who hadn't managed a full sentence in over a minute. For what it's worth, I hope you find whatever you're actually looking for, Joy. But I don't think it was ever really about me this morning. Then, to Joy, one final time, her voice dropping to something quiet enough that the whole studio leaned in to hear it. Next time you want to understand what a woman's scars actually mean to her, don't build a theory about them first. Just ask. You might be surprised how much truth people are willing to give you when you stop assuming it's a lie before they've even opened their mouth. She paused at the edge of the stage, looking back one final time at the stunned table. My mother spent the last years of her life trying to teach me that grace costs nothing and reveals everything. I think this morning proved her right. And with that, Angelina Jolie, Oscar winner, humanitarian, a woman who had turned 3 decades of scrutiny into quiet, unshakable composure, picked up her purse, nodded once to the stunned audience, and walked off the set of The View without looking back. The silence that followed was absolute. Joy Behar sat frozen, her notepad still open, the question she'd built now sitting exposed and suddenly hollow. Nearly a full minute passed before anyone at that table moved. Whoopi didn't say, "We'll be right back." Sarah stared at the door she'd walked through, her hand still pressed to her chest. Sunny hadn't blinked in what felt like 30 seconds. Somewhere in the audience, a woman had begun quietly crying, not from sadness exactly, but from something closer to reverence for what she'd just watched. A production assistant near the exit later said the last thing anyone saw of Angelina that morning was her pausing by the elevator, checking her phone briefly, and telling a young staffer who'd rushed over with her coat that she was perfectly fine, that some mornings simply required more patience with strangers than others, and this had just been one of them. The cameras kept rolling on an empty chair, an open notepad nobody wanted to look at anymore, and a co-host who had just discovered, in front of millions of people, exactly what it costs to mistake a survivor's grace for something that needed exposing.